This is Join Us in France, episode 373, 373. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France, everyday life in France, great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy, and news related to travel during the pandemic. Today, I bring you a conversation with my friend Elyse Rivin of Toulouse Guided Walks about the history of porcelain in France. Porcelain and the finer arts of setting a beautiful table are so French. So is collecting porcelain. How do you know how valuable the china you have at home is? What do you do with the stuff when it's passed down to you? We had a lot of fun talking about these things as well as the history of porcelain in France. For the French tip of the week, I'll share with you a few sentences you can use as conversation starters in France. A lot of you tell me that one of your goals when visiting France is to improve your French. How do you do that without signing up for language classes? Maybe you could learn how to strike a casual conversation with the people sitting next to you at a cafe or on a park bench or something. But in that case, you have to keep it light and appropriate culturally. So I'll give you a few tips for that. I'll also update you on travel news related to the ever-changing COVID situation in France. This podcast is supported by donors and listeners who buy my tours and services, including my very popular itinerary planning service. You can browse all of that at Annie's Boutique, joinusinfrance.com/boutique. The itinerary planning service is keeping me very busy. If you are going to book my services, make sure you do it 6 months before your trip, so there's plenty of time for you to make good use of the tips I will share with you. You can follow the show on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, or Twitter. Search for Join Us in France. And for show notes and a full edited transcript, go to joinusinfrance.com/373, the numeral. This is Join Us in France, episode 373, 373. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France, everyday life in France, great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy, and news related to travel during the pandemic. Today, I bring you a conversation with my friend Elyse Rivin of Toulouse Guided Walks about the history of porcelain in France. Porcelain and the finer arts of setting a beautiful table are so French. So is collecting porcelain. How do you know how valuable the china you have at home is? What do you do with the stuff when it's passed down to you? We had a lot of fun talking about these things as well as the history of porcelain in France. For the French tip of the week, I'll share with you a few sentences you can use as conversation starters in France. A lot of you tell me that one of your goals when visiting France is to improve your French. How do you do that without signing up for language classes? Maybe you could learn how to strike a casual conversation with the people sitting next to you at a cafe or on a park bench or something. But in that case, you have to keep it light and appropriate culturally. So I'll give you a few tips for that. I'll also update you on travel news related to the ever-changing COVID situation in France. This podcast is supported by donors and listeners who buy my tours and services, including my very popular itinerary planning service. You can browse all of that at Annie's Boutique, joinusinfrance.com/boutique. The itinerary planning service is keeping me very busy. If you are going to book my services, make sure you do it 6 months before your trip, so there's plenty of time for you to make good use of the tips I will share with you. You can follow the show on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, or Twitter. Search for Join Us in France. And for show notes and a full edited transcript, go to joinusinfrance.com/373, the numeral. Bonjour, Elyse.
Bonjour, Annie.
So today we have a conversation about something that I know absolutely nothing about.
Oh, and that makes me so happy because I really spent a lot of time preparing this because I'm going to give you a little lesson. There's a couple of things actually on the table. People can't see us, but we're going to talk about something that is part of what is known as the decorative arts. In French, like in English, there's a difference between what are called the major arts, which is painting, sculpture, even architecture, and what is unfortunately called the minor arts, which I don't believe really are minor. And what made me think about that today was that if you go to Japan, there is no such difference between the two. And in fact, they don't have a word for arts. I don't know exactly what the word is, but it's more about the aesthetic of things than anything else. So today, what we're going to do is talk about one of the things that is famous for being produced in France, and that is porcelain. And porcelain is one of what are called, and this is a translation from French because I honestly don't know if this expression is used in English, but in French, the expression is wonderful. It's les arts de feu.
Les arts de feu.
Les arts de feu, which means the arts that are from fire. And the reason why, and this is one of them, porcelain is a kind of ceramic, and glass making and things made from metal are all made by using heat and fire.
Yeah.
And so this is considered to be one of the arts of fire. And I love that expression.
Les arts de feu. Well, I was not aware of that expression. Beautiful.
And one of the ones that is the most famous, and I actually will include in the text specific places where you can actually find these things, except for certainly big department stores, which you can go to and look. But there are some very specific places where you can find them. One of the things that is famous for being produced in France, not only in France, so let's be clear about that. There are other places in Europe where it is produced, but the history of it really in Europe begins in France, and that's what's so wonderful about it. It is the art of not just ceramics, but of porcelain making.
So what's the difference? I mean, in my mind, ceramic is a kind of a rougher looking, maybe thicker vase or bowl or...
Technically, ceramic is anything made from some kind of clay, but there are many, many different kinds.
Yeah.
Or other kind of mineral that is baked, or what we call fired, in a kiln, which is just a very big oven.
That gets very hot.
It gets very hot. And so there are many different kinds. Stoneware, which a lot of people use as for their dishes, for instance. Stoneware is a rather heavy kind of ceramic. It's usually thicker and literally,
Heavier.
It's also the kind you can put in the oven. Porcelain, you don't put in the oven. Yes, porcelain you wouldn't put in the oven, but for other reasons. There are all kinds of ceramic. Ceramic is a very generic term for anything you can buy that is made from, that's not metallic, that's not glass.
So I'm drinking a cup of tea. Is that ceramic?
That is ceramic.
Okay, but it's not porcelain.
But it's not porcelain. In fact, now, on the table in front of you,
yes,
I don't even know if it's a coffee or tea cup, but it has a very beautiful design on it. I would like you to take it.
Can't. It's too far.
Can I get it for you? Wait.
Live from Elyse's house, and he reaches for a cup.
Look at this lovely little cup.
Can I look at the bottom?
Yes, I want you to look at the bottom and read what it says.
Villeroy et Bosch Group, Intarsia, Bone China.
Bone China.
Bone China.
Bone China. Okay, now put that down.
Yeah.
And pick up that lovely tiny little...
The white one.
White one and its saucer. And hold the saucer up to the window and look through it.
Yeah, you can kind of see through it.
You can see through it.
Yeah.
If you hold your fingers up on the other side, you will actually be able to see your fingers wiggle. The cup, the same way. You can hold it up. You can see.
Yeah. At the edge, you can see through it. I mean, a tiny bit of light comes through there.
And read what it says on the bottom of the cup.
It says BNC Limoges, France.
BNC Limoges, France.
And see, I wouldn't have thought that this was Limoges because it's not blue.
But just blue has nothing to do with it, okay? What you have in your hand is a real piece of true porcelain. it's white. The little cup is white. The saucer is white. It doesn't always have to be white, but in fact, it starts out by being white. But the difference between the other one that's called bone china, which is an expression that's in English. The French don't use the term bone china, but that's the expression that's used in English.
Bonne china.
No, actually, believe it or not, in French, they would say porcelain d'Allemagne. There are two kinds of porcelain. One that in English, and this really comes from England, is called bone china, which means it's a kind of soft porcelain.
I mean, soft, c'est pas soft, hein?
Yeah, soft has to do with the temperature used and the brittleness of the material.
But this lets a little bit of light through as well, yeah.
And the other one, that's what's called pure, true porcelain, and it's very, very, very hard. Although I don't want you to drop it on the floor.
No, I know what would happen if I dropped it on the floor. I would not be a happy camper.
And my dear departed mother-in-law would not be a happy camper either. So, porcelain, there were two places in France that produce porcelain. One is near Paris, and it is the town of Sèvres.
Yes.
Which is north of Paris, actually. And the other place is Limoges. And since we talked about Limoges in connection to some other things that were not such happy things, it seemed like it would be a nice thing to do is to talk about Limoges in relation to this, which is an art. And for many people, when they come to France, they're actually looking to buy something to take home that's really French. Now, I know a lot of people buy clothing, they buy scarves, you have to be very careful because a lot of things stamped made in France are actually not made in France at all. If you like tableware, if you like beautiful vases, if you like objects that are made from some form of ceramic, and you like some very beautiful, delicate designs, one of the things you can look for and buy is a set or a piece of porcelain.
That would be hard to take home, though, wouldn't it?
If it's a small piece, it's usually boxed up, very carefully bubble wrapped. And if you buy a lot, they ship it. That's one of the things about porcelain. Porcelain is a commodity, at least now, that is definitely high-end. It's not typical tableware.
This is a side thing, but I was really surprised when we moved from Utah to France. We did a big old container, like one of these 40-foot containers, and it was chock full of stuff. And I had packed 6 wine glasses that were extremely thin. Not a one of them broke. I was so surprised when I opened that box.
And you did the packing?
You can't pack your stuff when you move to France because they're worried about people importing weapons into France. And so they force you to hire a company to, at minimum, supervise. And the few boxes that I packed myself, they had to stay open so they could look through. Yeah.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, because in Utah, you can, go anywhere and buy weapons, all sorts of things. And you can hide them in a 40-foot container quite easily, I think.
Now, I'm sure that everybody who's been to Paris has visited the Louvre. And if you go into the Louvre, you can go into a group of rooms that are filled with magnificent tableware and vases and service pieces. And these are the pieces that were made for the kings and the queens and royalty.
So is this the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, or is it in the Louvre?
Actually, no. There are rooms of this in the Louvre, and then right next to the Louvre is the Museum of the Decorative Arts, and there's a whole wing with the pieces also. But the difference is that in the Louvre, you don't have modern, very contemporary designed pieces.
Okay.
Whereas in the Museum of Decorative Arts, they have basically from the old style up through very modern contemporary design so that you get an idea of the design. It's more involved with, the concept of design in it. But if you go into the Louvre, there's a room with Napoleon's beautiful pieces of porcelain from Sèvres, where you get the kings and the queens, all of them that started by using porcelain. And you can see what it looks like. Now, to be very honest, that kind of porcelain is not my taste. It's really over the top, it's got gilt on it. It's usually covered with enamel with beautiful designs, but it's actually extraordinary to look at. The manufacture of Sèvres was created in the 1770s by Louis XV and his mistress, thank you very much, Madame de Pompadour, who was very interested in the arts and, in fact, was a trendsetter. And she had a chateau in Sèvres. And when the French discovered this fabulous secret of making porcelain, which is what I'm going to tell you about, they decided, Louis XV decided, since she was so interested in this and wanted to be basically the patron of all of this, they set up the manufacture of the porcelain right next to her chateau in Sèvres, and it's been there ever since. But Louis XV did something else. Because he was the king, you and I could not. He bought the patent for making porcelain, and it became a royal property. And whether it was in Sèvres or whether it was in Limoges, anybody who wanted to try and open a factory to make porcelain had to pay and get permission from the king. And the king, of course, took off a commission off of everything.
Of course, yeah.
So he was doing very well with all of this now. He really was. But that is why, in fact, in Sèvres, from Louis XV on until the year 2009, only the king, royalty, aristocrats, and the government were allowed to have pieces made in Sèvres. And everybody else, you, me, and even very rich people who are not part of the royalty, their porcelain came from Limoges.
I see. It was the cream of the crop.
It was the cream of the crop. Now, personally, I prefer the cream of the crops Limoges, but there you go.
So if you want to see a massive piece of Sèvres porcelain, if you're at Saint-Germain-des-Prés, at the church, when you're facing the church, there's a park on the right side of the church. You go inside of that park. At the very end, there's a big old wall covered with porcelain, and it's mostly green. And it's Porcelaine de Sèvres, des Deux Sèvres, yeah.
It's interesting that it's literally wasn't until 2009 that Sèvres became something that anybody could actually have acquired, because otherwise, once the revolution came and they more or less got rid of the kings, because of course in the 19th century it was king yes, king no, king yes, king no. I mean, they sort of played yo-yo with the whole century that way. It was the presidents that wanted to have beautiful porcelain for the presidential palace, and they got it from Sèvres. So it's been the same way for 250, is that 250 or 350 years? I think it's 250, Ken. But this is the story of porcelain. Now, I know a lot of this because I had to learn a lot of this when I was doing my art history studies. And it has to do also with the connection between Europe and China. And that is why in England, it is called China. Nobody ever thinks about it. I can remember growing up and my mother saying, I'm going to go to the store and buy some china. That sounds ridiculous now when you think about it. I mean, I'm not going to buy the country. It's like it never dawned on me that it was a really weird thing to say. It's like, this is a really weird thing to say, right?
It is, yeah.
Go buy some china, fine china. Really? Okay. So this is the deal. The Chinese were very, very, very much in advance from way back in various art forms and in various forms of technology. And it is now for sure, proven for sure, that porcelain was invented in China in about 200 BC.
Wow.
And I have been to the Chinese collection at the Metropolitan Museum in New York many times. And there are pieces there that are almost 2,000 years old that are absolutely magnificent. And what happened was that the Chinese knew that they had come across a technique that was precious and that really was something they did not want other people to know about. They traded, starting in the early Middle Ages, they traded with other countries, they traded with lots of places, but nobody was allowed to know the secret of how this particular kind of ceramic was produced. And this goes right through to the times of Marco Polo, who was, of course, from Venice. He and his family, who were traders and lived for a number of years in China.
Right.
And this is in the 13th century, in the 1200s. And eventually Marco Polo moved back to Venice. I think he finished his life actually as a merchant in Venice and brought with him several pieces. The oldest piece of Chinese porcelain in Europe is in St. Marco's in Venice still. I would like to go back now and see which piece it is because I haven't got a clue which piece it is. But it's apparently a piece that was given to him as thank you for whatever it was he was doing in the trades. And it dates back centuries prior to the 1200s. But he did not know what the secret was. He was a merchant. He was an import-export guy. I mean, that's what Marco Polo was, And yet, what happened was that the royalty in various European countries, they loved this stuff, and it's translucent, as you could see. It doesn't matter if it's got a white coating on it or if it has a pale green, which is what's called celadon, or it has different colors on it. If it's true porcelain, you hold it up to the light and it has a certain translucidity. It's very magical, actually. And so, little by little, into the Middle Ages, the kings and queens wanted more of this stuff. But it was extremely expensive to buy because they had to literally, it sounds like today, right? Get it from China. Except today, now you get it on a container that comes on a ship. And now, of course, we're having a problem because they're all stuck out there because it's too expensive, Well, imagine on a camel, on a caravan that took 4 months to get across the Gobi Desert and all the rest of it. I mean, never mind, talk about breaking pieces, there you go. So, starting in the 1500s and 1600s, various ceramic chemists in Germany and in France tried guessing what the formula was because they wanted to see if they could make it here so that they could save fortunes in money because all of the kings and queens wanted it on their tables, And so there were two ceramic chemists thought by looking at it, analyzing it, obviously they didn't have all of these, microscopes and all that nonsense back then, they thought they came up with the right formula. And so at the end of the 1600s, where this is years, this is centuries and centuries and centuries where they have no idea how this stuff is made. There is something that's a magical secret ingredient, right? And so they try using melted glass. They were actually warm, but they weren't hot, you see. So what happened was they made something and it broke. It wasn't translucent. They were ready to give up. And we get to the turn of the century, just about the year 1700. And there is a French Jesuit priest who is a great intellectual and who, I don't know why, I don't know if it was his idea, it was somebody else's idea, gets sent to China as a missionary.
Mm-hmm.
It happens that this man, whose name was Father Entrecol, he spoke Mandarin, or he learned to speak Mandarin. He learned to speak Chinese. And he was first stationed in one city, I can't remember which city it was. And then, by pure chance, he got stationed in a city called, and I'm going to massacre this because I have no idea how this is really pronounced, Jiangshan, okay? And in this city, this is the city where, to this day, this is where porcelain is made. And what happened was, when the court found out that there was this Jesuit priest who was an intellectual who spoke perfect Chinese, was in this place where the porcelain came from, they gave him a mission. This is mission impossible. He didn't get paid extra for this. So, he's lucky that it was the time you didn't get executed for this either. They told him that they wanted him to find the secret formula.
Right.
And it happened that because he was a missionary and because his Chinese was good,
Mm-hmm.
he went to work talking to the workers in the factories. And little by little, whether it was one person, several people, who knows, it took several years. In 1712, he sent back a long letter, which you actually can still find because it's in the National Archives. It was a letter that included the formula for making porcelain. And he sent a second letter back 10 years later. I don't know if the Chinese ever found out that he was the one that did this because he lived there until he was like an old man and nothing ever happened to him. But by sending back these two letters, which are very famous, the court was able to ask the chemists and the ceramicists to try and make real porcelain. And one of the things that they discovered, and this is, I know all of this, but to me, this is one of those stories that I absolutely love to tell. The secret ingredient is a kind of clay. I don't think clay is actually the correct word, but I'm using that word. It's called in French and in English, kaolin, Kaolin, which is a transliteration of the Chinese word jiangling, something like that.
Something, yeah.
Which means the clay from the hills of this city. And it turns out that it's very, very, very white, very chalky, very crumbly, but it's got silicates in it. And a silicate is, is the same thing that is used in making glass. And somehow, centuries before, the Chinese had discovered that if you put this material into a very high temperature oven, that when it melts, when you mix it with something else, it melts, but then it hardens and it is translucent and it is very, very, very hard. And only kaolin is used in making true porcelain.
So the whole thing is made of kaolin, or is it a mix?
No, it's mixed with two other ingredients. It's mixed with a little bit of aluminum, and I can't remember what the third ingredient is, and it's made...
No clay?
No clay. No clay. And it's mixed with water to make a paste. And if for it to be true porcelain, it has to have a minimum of 30% kaolin.
So you're telling me that there's aluminum in this thing?
Yeah, it's aluminum. Well, it's aluminum. There's another word that follows afterward. It's not aluminum, the pure metal. It's like, they're
We're not chemists, as is clear.
But so what happened was that when they discovered the formula, the problem was nobody knew where the kaolin was in France and whether there is an kaolin in France. And the place that they did discover some at first was in Meissen in Germany. Now, there's a huge porcelain industry that comes out of Meissen, and most of the Meissen is blue and white, which is probably where in your head you're thinking of blue in relation to porcelain, because they knew that when they discovered it at approximately the same time that the kaolin was the secret ingredient, they were hills in Saxe, which is, to be honest, I'm not even sure where that is in Germany. But anyway, the hills had deposits, huge deposits of this. And so France was forced to buy the kaolin from there, and they brought it to Sèvres, which was the first place that they started producing porcelain, and that is why it became associated with royalty. But this is what makes the story even more incredible and ironic. This priest, where was he from?
Oh, Limoges.
He was from Limoges.
Limoges.
He was from Limoges. And what happened was that he told people in Limoges, because he did come back, when he retired and finished his life out in France as an old man, and he went back to Limoges.
He told them too.
And he told them about this formula. And it turns out that some people were doing other kinds of, I was reading this, I read this twice, but it's rather an amazing story. Some chemist, he was a chemist. He'd heard this story from this priest, and he said, you know what? I wonder if this is this stuff. And it turns out that his wife had discovered this vein of this white kind of chalky mineral that was in the hills. It's just south of Limoges. A few miles away from Limoges. And she was using it to wash things and make them very, very white. I don't know how she was using it exactly. I think she was rubbing things with it. And so they went to test it. And sure enough, it was kaolin. The largest veins of kaolin were and still are in Limoges.
Huh.
And now Limoges exports kaolin to all the other places in Western Europe that want to produce porcelain.
So is it like a mining operation? Because when I think of a mine, it's like an ugly...
No, but there are quarries. It's a quarry, not, as opposed to a mine, for coal. It's a quarry, and you can see these veins of this beautiful white. It's kind of like quarries for marble. You can see they're like veins of this stuff. What happened was that in Limoges, even though Louis XV also decided he was going to buy that up, which meant that he had the patent. But he didn't say in Limoges it had to be exclusively for royalty. So there were several enterprising people who decided that they were going to start producing porcelain and sell it. Of course, it was still a commodity that was not for poor people, but they were not exclusively for just royal people. And so the very first porcelain factory opened in Limoges in 1771. And it's still one of the first ones. And guess what it has become? Royal Limoges, which is one of the most famous brands of porcelain in Limoges. And so within the space of 25 years between basically that and 1800, several other wealthy merchants, enterprising people who hired their own chemists and ceramicists, they themselves also opened up factories to produce porcelain, and they started selling it everywhere, not just in France, but in other European countries. And that is why porcelain has so much come to be associated with France, even though now you have 4 countries that still produce pure, real porcelain. You have France, Germany, England, and Poland, of all places, and China. Well, of course, China. I mean, China has never stopped producing porcelain, But of course, now we don't need their porcelain anymore.
So you meant in Europe?
In Europe. There's a social part of the history attached to it, too. Starting in 1807, there were 5 factories with 200 workers in Limoges. And it is the best kaolin in quality in all of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
In 1827, there were 16 factories.
Mm-hmm.
And Limoges was at its heyday. This was a hugely prosperous city. Everything turned around the manufacture of porcelain. There was everything. They had the water, they had the forests, because you have to have wood to burn. Oh, and of course, I forgot one thing that's very important. Not only do you need to have the kaolin, but the secret, besides using kaolin, is that it has to be fired. Now, fired is the word that's used. You could say baked, but basically the technical term for ceramics is fired at over 1,200 degrees.
Right, so super hot.
And the best, hardest porcelain is even fired at 1,400 degrees Celsius. So you had to have these enormous, enormous, enormous kilns with huge forests to provide all of the wood. And that is why Limoges became such a prosperous place. In 1850, there were 30 porcelain factories in Limoges.
1850.
1850. And along comes a man named Mr. Haviland, who actually is the son of an American family that, for whatever reason, it's not clear, leaves the United States and goes to live in France.
Okay.
And he...
Because it's nice here. That's why.
Yeah, I know. But, it's like 1850 is not now. I mean, you wonder why, whatever. For whatever reason, he was brought up in the Limousin area, in the region around Limoges, from a, relatively wealthy but not super rich family. And he decided that he had a lot of contacts in the United States and that he was going to open a factory that would cater to American tastes. And he created the largest porcelain factory ever produced or made in Limoges that had over 400 workers. And most of what he produced was exported back to the United States. And the demand for porcelain became even greater, so that porcelain became famous just about everywhere. And it became the tableware for all the wealthy and important people, including in the United States. By the end of the 19th century, however, it turns out that working conditions for many of the people were pretty awful. They were working long days. There was extraordinary heat. It was sometimes very dangerous. And you have the beginning of labor movements at the end of the 19th century, not just here in porcelain factories, but of course everywhere. This is the time of Zola. This is the time of this kind of turmoil. And little by little, what happens is it affects the ability of Limoges to keep all of these factories open, so that by the time you get into the beginning of the 20th century, there are fewer of these factories, and then you get the huge crash, the huge depression of the 1920s, and the majority of these porcelain factories closed down. Ironically, the 2 big ones in Sèvres never closed down because they are royalty and then government, and so they keep going no matter what. But they take the kaolin from Limoges up to Sèvres to make the porcelain up there. It's just that it's not available to people like you and me.
See, this is so bizarre.
Isn't it bizarre? But what happens is this last part of the 20th century, there is another movement to reopen the factories and to create more important contemporary design with porcelain, because there's more of an interest, starting really in the last part of the 20th century, in decorative arts and in beautiful forms of design. And it also coincides with the fact that lots of architects and people like that are interested in designing tableware. They're not just interested in making houses anymore and things like that. So you have these kind of multidisciplinary people who want to use porcelain because it's such a magnificent material to use. And so it comes back to life. And so right now, believe it or not, in Limoges, there are 12 factories and there are over 1,000 people who still work in making porcelain.
And I assume that you can stop in Limoges and they have stores and...
I made a list with the specific addresses of 5 or 6 that are connected to some of these factories. So, of course, you can go to any major department store.
Right.
You can go to Galerie Lafayette. You can go even here in Toulouse. We have a lovely store called Medica that has really beautiful tableware. And you can find examples of the porcelain, soft porcelain, which is bone china, and the hard porcelain, which means it's stamped in green and it says Limoges, France. And starting in the 21st century, because it turns out, here's for irony, there's irony, China is making rip-offs of the Limoges porcelain. What goes around comes around.
That's right. It's fair.
What happened was that the porcelain factories in Limoges made a demand, first in France, and then with the United Nations, the World Heritage, whatever the UNESCO, whatever World Heritage, to kind of cease and desist, and said that they wanted to create a label that would be able to be proof that it's true porcelain from Limoges. So
an AOC.
It's an AOC.
Is it an AOC?
There is an AOC. And if you really want to know whether it's porcelain created in Limoges, if you look at the bottom, you will see the little stamp. These pieces are older, so it's in green, and it does say Limoges.
Right.
It does say Limoges, but there's a new design on the stamp, and it has like a little bit of a crown on top of it, but it's green, and it says Limoges, France, and that is really the proof that it's French porcelain.
Yeah.
And it is now, not only is it an AOC, but it is part of the patrimoine immatériel of France. So you help me translate that.
Oh, the immaterial wealth.
It's like savoir-faire, it has to do with like
the know-how.
Right? But it took them a bunch of years, and the AOC finally it came through actually only in 2017.
Huh.
They had to work on it really for a long time, because at first people were saying, no, it's just so because there's an economic competition with China. And they said no, because what was happening was that China was making fake Limoges porcelain, stamping it.
Right, because a lot of wealthy Europeans and Americans have heard of Limoges porcelain when they might have never heard of any porcelain made in China.
Exactly.
Yeah, they didn't fight for their image quite as much.
So, there are several very famous brands, and one of them is Royal Limoges. There are 2 or 3 others. I'll just mention names, but it's because if people are really interested in any of the magnificent department stores in Paris, besides specialty tableware stores or houseware stores, will have some of it. But you have the Havilland, which, by the way, has its own museum in Limoges, and is the only place where you can actually visit one of these huge kilns. I looked at a picture of it. It's 50 meters high.
Oh, so that's really interesting, industrial kind of tourism.
Absolutely. They do a tour there, and they explain the whole process of it and everything. And it's this kind of weird conical shape. And you can imagine you would melt in 2 seconds in 1400 degrees Celsius, And then there's 2 brands, one of which I really like because I love some of the designs, and it's called Bernardo. They are sold in all of the fancy stores, but these are places that if you go to Limoges, you can go to their factory shops, and I'm not talking about seconds. This is not an outlet, this is the places where you can actually go and buy.
So the same way you can go see champagne at the source, you can go see Limoges porcelain at the source.
At the source, right.
That's interesting.
I was thinking somewhere down the road a little bit, what I'd like to do is do another one about glassware, because we have famous glassware in France. We have Dome and a bunch of other brands of beautiful glassware, which is another whole story that has to do with that kind of art.
When I went to see the Napoleon exhibit in Paris, they had some beautiful pieces that were made for Napoleon.
Yes.
But I don't remember if they were from Sèvres. Probably Sèvres.
Oh, yes, they were.
Yeah, just gorgeous.
And I'm telling you, there were like 3 or 4 rooms in the Louvre that have nothing but...
Now, typically, rooms full of...
It gets boring after.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of this same old.
And I don't really know the industry.
Right.
And it's not something I've collected. Like, at my house, I'm at the point where I told my husband and daughter, when... Because we always break these coffee cup thingies. There's always the one that's breaking. And so I just say, hey, when you go somewhere interesting, bring back a cup. Just one.
Just one.
And then we have an assortment of cups from different places.
Me too.
And it's kind of fun to see where they're from, whatever. I don't have a nice china that I just bring out when guests come.
Nice.
My mom did.
Yeah, my mom did too, and I have actually some really nice glassware, probably more than china. But I was looking at some of the other individual little pieces that I have that I bought, mostly myself again. There are other kinds of ceramic that are famous in France, but they are not china. It happens that I have this because we inherited it, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, my other pieces are pieces that are other kinds of ceramic, as we were saying earlier, that are thicker, heavier, and they don't have that magic.
Yeah. So one year, I don't know why, my husband bought me a really lovely cup with the Queen of England on it. And I always wondered, why did he buy me one teacup with the Queen of England? But anyway, I should ask him.
You should ask him.
But I'm going to have to look at it and see if I can see light
That's
through it.
right. And look at the back and see if it says bone china or not.
Bone china or something, yeah.
But, one of the things about the translucidity, it has to be up to a certain thickness, because there is porcelain that, of course, is made thicker than that, and then it will no longer have that translucidity. But there are pieces, even when they're painted, because the truth is, like the little white cup you just held up, that's been basically fired twice. The first time it's fired, it's the raw shape. And then when it's baked, it's called a biscuit. That's the term that's used in French and in English. And then they would take that, because you see it's got that beautiful, shiny, kind of almost luminescent white kind of covering. That would be dipped, literally.
I see. And some of them are painted by hand. And I think in Sèvres, that's what they specialize in.
That's right.
The really amazing painting. And there's videos. I've watched a video that showed today what the craftspeople can do. Teeny tiny painting. Beautiful, beautiful stuff.
We saw a few of the several pieces in Chantilly, actually.
And they had birds, too. They were kind of cool looking.
There's now a museum. The Museum of Ceramics for all kinds of ceramics is, in fact, in Sèvres. It's not in Limoges. So they're all examples of every kind of ceramic you can possibly imagine. But it does say that if you want to buy Sèvres, every piece now is unique. I can't even imagine what the price must be.
Yeah.
Because nothing is made in series. I have one behind you in the case there that's a little one of these hand-painted little flower things my mom loved. These were all English, This is bone china, by the way. None of these are hard china. These are what's called bone china, which means they're kind of porcelain, but not the pure, hardest kind of porcelain. But they're all hand-painted.
It's really interesting. Yesteryear, they had a way of, like, you knew it was going to be a special meal if my mom brought out the china.
That's right.
And the cutlery.
That's right.
She had a special for everything. And my parents were not rich people.
But it was important.
But it was really important. And she had a whole set just for that. And we lived in a small apartment. So at my house, I don't have that because... Well, first of all, my sister kept the cutlery and all of that, the silverware, which is fine. But I don't think we even kept all the plates and all the things. There were too many things. And we didn't have room in our house.
That's what happened.
Who wants this stuff?
I think your parents, like mine, my mom received a bunch of stuff at the wedding.
Yes.
And that was it. They were poor pretty much, but she had these things that were really of a certain value that mostly she never used. She used them 2 or 3 times a year.
Right. You used it for special occasions.
That was it.
And I did keep some really fine wine glasses, and they're kind of an interesting shape, but I never use them because I don't want to break them.
Yeah.
And also, they're too small for wine glasses for nowadays. The stem is really short.
Oh, they're those kind, yeah.
Yeah. It's like more of a aperitif kind of.
Aperitif glass, yeah.
Anyway, so
we're gonna have to rethink our table arts and our other arts, decorative art. I think decorative arts are pretty neat, the whole history of them, I mean, it's different because you don't just stick it, well, you and I do. I mean, in a sense, you can put a piece on the wall or in a glass case and just look at it. But the thing about them that makes them so interesting is that they wound up mostly being used at the same time.
Right. And nowadays, if you want to do something special for a special meal like Thanksgiving or Christmas or something, you just use a plain old white plate, but underneath you put like a gold plate or a colored plate. I do that. And you make it pretty that way. But it's a cheapo underplate from wherever, probably China. And it just lifts up your normal plates and things. A few years ago, I decided I wanted to get new cutlery, but then my husband lost his job. But now he has another job, so maybe I should
Maybe you go. There you go.
go back.
Go, girl.
Go get my new cutlery, because our cutlery is really old. It's really old. It's not like it's at the top of my list for things to do, but yeah, I like tables. I like good meals, so it should go with.
I really like tableware. So, I mean, there are certain, everybody has different taste and what they like in terms of color and pattern and everything. But when the Galerie Lafayette in Toulouse had a special store that was just for things like that, I would sometimes go in there and just walk around and look at all of it. I love it. I would like to create a lending library of tableware.
That would be really good.
I would love to be able to do that.
Somebody create an app.
So that you have all these dishes and glasses and whatever, and you keep them for a month or two.
The thing is shipping them. It's expensive and delicate.
I hardly ship anything except my brain.
All right, Elyse. Thank you very much. I learned a ton. That was really good.
See you soon.
Merci. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. PATREON. Join us, no spaces or dashes. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you for many years now. You are wonderful. And a shout out this week to new patrons, Lisa Leone, Sharon Stoffel, and Barbara Colvin. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. My thanks also to Sarah Smith for sending in a one-time donation by using the green button on any page on joinusinfrance.com that says, Tip Your Guide. The itinerary reviews are keeping me really busy, and I like doing them because I really enjoy talking to you, my listeners. You hear a lot of tips on the podcast that you can't necessarily remember a few months later or years later when you're ready for your own trip to France. So I filter all of that information that I know from growing up here, from living in France now, and also from all the visitors who talk to me about their trips. And that combination makes for great experiences in France, which is why the service is so popular. But it takes time for me to prepare these custom itineraries. So if that's a service you'd like to purchase, do it 6 to 8 months before your trip, please. Pricing and details are at joinusinfrance.com/boutique. The French expression of the week is going to be, how do you strike up a conversation in France? Well, here are a few suggestions for you. You could ask them if they live in the town where you are, and then volunteer where you live. It would go something like, Vous habitez à Paris? Moi, j'habite à Atlanta. Or, vous habitez à Toulouse? Moi, j'habite à New York. Whatever the case may be. Or if you have a dog with them, you could say, Comment s'appelle votre chien? C'est un labrador? Or c'est un King Charles? Ou c'est un labraniche? I don't know, whatever breed the dog seems to be. And if they seem happy sharing on a geographical theme, you could ask, vous avez visité le Canada? Or wherever you're from, vous avez visité le Mexique, vous avez visité l'Amérique, whatever. Or, quel est votre endroit préféré à Paris? Quel est votre endroit préféré à Lyon? Etc. If they are happy talking about their dog, tell them about your own dog at home. Now, dogs, trips, cities are all acceptable conversation starters that should not rattle anyone. But don't ask them, are you French? Or no, don't do that. So, you just have to be generic enough. Another thing that works wonderfully well in France is to ask for help. Because it's a great conversation starter. Don't stop someone who is obviously rushing to get somewhere. But if you're sitting on a bench and wonder, how am I going to get to whatever place later? Just ask them, est-ce que vous savez comment aller à l'opéra? French people really want to be helpful. It's kind of in our DNA. But we don't want to kind of seem like we're pushing the information on you. You have to go asking for it. So travel things, dog, pets, where you live is a normal, non-rattling kind of conversation. And I think most people would be happy to have a chat with you, especially if they're just sitting there on a bench and not doing anything much. And when you're done with a conversation, don't forget to say au revoir and don't forget to say bonjour at the start as well. This week in French news, the French government is going to ease restrictions put in place just before Christmas to limit large group gatherings and dancing. The easing of restrictions will begin mid-February. I think concerts and festivals are going to go ahead this spring and summer if French hospitals continue to cope well with the pandemic, as they have been really. I can't imagine the workload, but they seem to be handling it quite well. At the same time, the pass vaccinal is now in place, which means unvaccinated French people can no longer take a COVID test and go to a restaurant or get on an airplane or attend a soccer game. They will now need to show proof of vaccination. And that's why we used to call it pass sanitaire, which meant you could prove you weren't sick by taking a COVID test, to pass vaccinal, which means you've been vaccinated. Some people ask, why not make vaccines mandatory as they've done in Austria, for example? The French government says they don't want to put in a mandate without enforcement, and it would be too hard to enforce vaccine mandates on the whole population. So they are continuing to squeeze the unvaccinated and make their lives difficult, but no mandates. And it's working. Yesterday in France, 42,000 people got their first dose of vaccine. And every day, 30 to 40, around that, new people get their first dose. 93.2% of the population over 12 has been vaccinated. Some with 3 doses, some with 2 doses, some with just 1 dose. But we keep making progress. Despite all of that, lots of people are getting notified that someone they work with or a friend has COVID, which now makes them a cas contact. Cas contact. That means a contact case. This week, my daughter had lunch right across from a coworker who had just come down with COVID but didn't know it yet. She's been tested and she's negative. As per protocol, she will take 2 more tests in the next 4 days. To me, the fact that she can sit right across from someone with COVID without a mask, since they were eating, and chat with him for 90 minutes and not get herself infected is a great testament to how well being triple vaxxed works. The same with Elyse. She's a teacher and she had a group of university students who are on a European tour. She got notified that one of the students has COVID and apparently was kind of looking a little sick. And so she got tested. She's triple vaxxed and she's negative too. And that means that she can come to my house on Monday to record an episode about Molière. Yay! Now, pretty much anyone who has kids in school will be a cas contact a lot, like maybe once a week. I don't know. I don't know how much longer we can deal with this business of testing constantly, but I guess the alternative is to stick our heads in the sand, and that would not be good either. At any rate, so far it looks like for folks visiting France this spring and summer, you'll be fine. Lots of things are going to go on, but keep in mind that you need to have a plan for what you do if you test positive before you fly, either before you fly away from home, which I guess is not as big a deal, but also before you fly home from France, which could be a bigger deal. So consider all that and then decide if a visit to France is for you right now. Show notes and a full transcript for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/373. And remember that I would love for you to introduce a friend to the podcast, send them a link to an episode that you think they would find interesting or valuable, and I bet they will thank you. Next week on the podcast, an episode about a leisurely trip through France with Carl Carlson. Send questions or feedback to annie@joinusinfrance.com, but I just went through my spam and saw that a whole bunch of emails from fans got caught in the spam filter, mixed in with all the messages that are indeed spam. I want you to know that I respond to just about every message I receive, even if only with a quick thank you. So if you don't hear from me, try emailing annie.sargent@gmail.com or tag me on the Facebook group, and I will look through the spam once in a while, even if it feels icky, like dumpster diving, but I guess I have to. Thank you for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent, and copyright 2022 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.